All right, so we're diving in something pretty fascinating today. Neurodiversity affirming therapy.
Specifically for people with autism.
Right, exactly. And, the sources you gave me for this one, really interesting stuff.
Yeah?
Articles, blog posts, even some website excerpts, all focusing on autism, how it's viewed, how it's treated. So, I guess the biggest question that jumps out at me is, how is this new approach different, compared to like the traditional autism therapies we've seen in the past?
Yeah, no, that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
I think for a long time, the prevailing view of autism was really through a medical lens,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a disorder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that needed correcting.
Okay, yeah,
And neurodiversity affirming therapy really flips that script.
it does.
It does. Recognizing autism not as a defect, but as a valuable way of being. A different way of being, but valuable.
Okay, so a whole new perspective then.
Yeah.
The term neurodiversity comes up a lot in these sources.
It does, yeah.
A lot. What does that actually mean?
Well, essentially, neurodiversity acknowledges the natural variations in human brains and how they function. So it moves away from this idea that there is one normal
Right, right.
and instead recognizes that there's a whole spectrum of neurological differences, with autism being one point along that spectrum.
So instead of trying to make autistic people more normal, this approach focuses on what? Understanding,
Yeah.
accepting their experiences.
Exactly. And that's a major shift from those traditional therapies that, often focused on sort of changing autistic behaviors to fit societal expectations.
Right.
Things like suppressing stimming and forcing eye contact, or, even teaching social skills, but in a way that might feel really unnatural or forced.
Yeah, and I'm seeing in these sources that those traditional methods, they could actually be quite harmful, leading to, I think, one term that comes up is masking
Yeah.
and something called the autism tax. Can you kind of unpack those a
Yeah.
bit?
So masking is basically when autistic individuals try to hide their autistic traits.
To fit in. Yeah. Right.
Exactly. And they're sort of constantly performing, pretending to be someone they're not. And that can be incredibly exhausting
I bet.
and can lead to burnout, anxiety, even depression. And then the autism tax, that refers to the extra challenges that autistic individuals face in a world that's not really designed for them.
Okay.
Things like, sensory overload
Right.
in noisy environments, or facing social stigma, discrimination.
So it sounds like this approach is really trying to get at the root of those challenges. But if we're not focusing on like fixing autistic traits, do we just ignore potential challenges altogether?
That's a really important point.
Yeah. I mean, is there a risk of overlooking areas where support might be beneficial?
So neurodiversity affirming therapy, it doesn't mean ignoring difficulties or refusing support. It's about approaching that support in a way that respects the individual's autonomy and their identity.
So it's not about saying everything's fine, you don't need any help. It's more about saying, okay, let's work together to figure out what kind of support you need, how we can best provide it in a way that honors who you are.
Exactly. So for example, if an autistic individual is struggling with, let's say, social anxiety,
Okay.
a neurodiversity affirming therapist might help them develop coping mechanisms or communication strategies rather than trying to make them, more extroverted.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. The sources also highlight the importance of recognizing and addressing potential trauma that many autistic individuals have experienced. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, unfortunately, many autistic individuals have faced bullying, rejection, even abuse because of their differences.
Right.
And so a trauma-informed approach, it acknowledges those experiences and tries to create a safe space for healing. And this might involve, helping them process that past trauma, build self-esteem, and develop those healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with, those difficult emotions.
So creating a therapeutic environment where they feel safe, respected, understood.
Precisely. It's about validating their experiences and empowering them to take control of their lives.
Mhm.
Now, going back to masking for a moment, it makes me wonder, why do autistic individuals feel the need to mask in the first place? Like, what are those societal pressures that kind of contribute to that?
That's a great question. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, imagine growing up being told, either directly or indirectly, that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. You need to change to be accepted.
Right.
That's the experience of many autistic people. So they learn to mask because the world often just doesn't accommodate their differences.
Which leads us to another important concept I'm seeing here, this idea of internalized ableism.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little further?
So internalized ableism, It can be kind of like constantly second-guessing yourself.
Oh, okay.
Feeling like your natural way of being is somehow wrong or inadequate. It's the result of absorbing all those negative societal messages about disability.
So it's almost like absorbing those external pressures and turning them inwards. Makes me think about like the long-term impact of that. Feeling like you have to constantly hide who you are.
Absolutely. And that's where this shift in perspective offered by neurodiversity affirming therapy becomes so important.
Instead of trying to change autistic individuals, we need to start changing the way society views them and interacts with them.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where autistic individuals can be their authentic selves without fear of judgment or rejection.
This is all incredibly fascinating. It definitely challenges a lot of preconceived notions I think I had about autism. I'm curious to delve a little deeper into the specific benefits this approach has. Like what kind of positive outcomes might we see in, individuals who undergo neurodiversity affirming therapy?
Oh, that's a great question. And we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
The research suggests that this approach can have a profound impact on mental health, well-being, relationships.
Okay.
And that's really what we're going to be exploring next.
So we've talked about this shift in perspective, right? This idea of neurodiversity affirming therapy. But what does that actually look like in practice? What kind of positive changes can this approach bring about?
Well, one of the most remarkable things you see is this potential to really foster self-acceptance.
Yeah.
Reduce that internalized ableism we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Imagine, growing up being told, either directly or indirectly, that there's something wrong with you,
Yeah.
fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the experience of so many autistic people. So neurodiversity affirming therapy, it really tries to work to dismantle those messages.
So it's about replacing that narrative of brokenness with what? Self-worth, pride.
Exactly. Celebrating neurodiversity, not
Yeah.
just tolerating it. And that shift can be incredibly powerful
Yeah.
because when autistic individuals begin to view their autism as just an integral part of who they are, rather than a deficit, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities. And speaking of possibilities, I'm seeing some really interesting stuff here about the benefits for mental health.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, reduced anxiety, depression,
Yeah.
even some of the sources mentioned trauma symptoms.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? If you're constantly masking your true self,
Right.
it's going to take a toll on your mental well-being.
Yeah.
So neurodiversity affirming therapy provides that space for individuals to unpack those experiences, to process that trauma, to develop coping mechanisms that really work for them.
One thing that stood out to me was this idea of, stronger, more fulfilling relationships.
Yeah.
How does embracing neurodiversity actually lead to better relationships?
I think it comes down to authenticity.
Yeah.
When you're constantly masking, you're not really showing up as your true self in those relationships.
Right.
And that can lead to a sense of disconnect. Like you're not really seen or understood. So by embracing their neurodiversity, individuals can really build those genuine connections. They can communicate their needs more effectively, set boundaries that honor their sensitivities, find people who appreciate them for who they truly are.
That's so important. And it seems like there's also a strong emphasis on, like, self-advocacy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, by understanding their own needs and their strengths, autistic individuals can learn to advocate for themselves more effectively,
Yeah.
in all areas of their lives.
Okay.
School, work, relationships, the community. It's about empowering them to speak up, ask for what they need, and challenge those systems that might be creating barriers.
These sources are just packed with, like, real-world examples that bring these concepts to life. I know one that really stood out to me was this discussion about the worst things to say to high-masking autistics.
All right.
What about that piece resonated with you?
I think what's fascinating about that is it highlights those subtle, often unintentional ways that we invalidate the experiences of artistic people.
Yeah.
Phrases like, you don't seem autistic, or everyone's a little bit on the spectrum.
Right.
Those can be incredibly hurtful because they minimize those very real challenges that they face.
It's like saying you're not autistic enough to deserve support or understanding.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to educate ourselves about the lived experiences of autistic people,
Yeah.
to listen to what they have to say about their needs and their challenges.
Which actually reminds me of another example that resonated with me, this autism tax discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Can you just remind our listeners what that refers to?
Yeah, the autism tax, it really tries to illustrate uh, the hidden costs, the burdens that autistic individuals carry simply by existing in a world that isn't designed for them.
Mm.
So it's that extra time and energy it takes to navigate social situations, the financial strain, of uh, sensory-friendly clothing, accommodations, the emotional toll of masking, and the discrimination they face.
It really does illuminate those systemic disadvantages that autistic people experience. It's making me think about that traditional medical model of autism.
Yeah.
It seems like focusing just on fixing those traits, it kind of misses the bigger picture. Those societal barriers, the importance of acceptance.
You've hit on a really crucial point here, and it raises a question. Could a neurodiversity affirming approach be beneficial not just for these individuals,
Right.
but for society as a whole?
That is such an intriguing question. I would love to explore that further. Like, what potential benefits do you see in embracing neurodiversity on a societal level?
Well, just imagine a society that values diversity in all its forms,
Right.
including neurological diversity,
Mm.
a society that recognizes the unique strengths, the contributions of autistic individuals.
Rather than viewing them through this lens of deficit or disorder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We start thinking about accessibility, not just in terms of physical spaces,
Yeah,
but communication styles, sensory sensitivities, social expectations.
that's a good point.
We create workplaces that value different ways of thinking, problem solving. We design educational systems that cater to those different learning styles, neurocognitive strengths.
So instead of trying to make everyone fit this single mold,
Yeah,
we embrace the idea that different minds bring different strengths to the table.
exactly. And it's exciting to think about a world where stimming isn't seen as disruptive, but as a natural form of self-regulation, where direct communication is appreciated, even if it doesn't adhere to those typical social niceties,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
differences are celebrated, not pathologized.
It's like we've been overlooking a vast pool of talent potential by trying to force everyone into this one-size-fits-all mold.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about those practical benefits,
Yeah.
It's about creating a more just and equitable world, a world where everyone feels valued, respected for who they are.
So neurodiversity affirming therapy, it's not just about individual well-being, it's a social justice issue.
Absolutely. It's about challenging that systemic ableism that marginalizes and excludes autistic individuals. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their neurology.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, for me at least. It's made me question assumptions that I didn't even realize I had.
Yeah.
And just given me a whole new perspective on autism and neurodiversity in general.
That's the power of knowledge,
Yeah,
of critical thinking.
it is.
And the journey doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, to seek out the voices of autistic individuals, and to challenge the status quo in whatever ways you can.
Because building a more inclusive, equitable world requires all of us to be informed, engaged, willing to challenge our own perspectives.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So we've talked about embracing neurodiversity on this societal level. It's a pretty big concept to really wrap your head around. Like, what would that world actually look like?
Well, imagine just walking down the street,
Right.
And you see people stemming, flapping their hands, rocking, spinning,
Yeah.
and nobody even looks twice.
Wow.
Or think about workplaces where, direct communication is valued. Sensory sensitivities, they're just accommodated, no questions asked.
Interesting.
Schools where all those different learning styles are not just tolerated but celebrated and supported. Where autistic students feel like they can be themselves completely.
That sounds incredible.
Yeah.
But I mean, realistically, how do we get there? How do we get from where we are now to that kind of world? It seems like such a monumental shift.
It does. It definitely requires, a real change in mindset, a willingness to kind of challenge that status quo.
Right, right.
I think we have to start by educating ourselves about neurodiversity, really listening to the voices of autistic individuals.
Yeah.
We need to advocate for policies and practices that promote, inclusion and accessibility for everyone. And we need to challenge ableism and discrimination wherever we encounter it.
So it's not just about changing individual attitudes. We're talking systemic change here, too.
Absolutely. I mean, we need to look at our systems, our structures, like education, healthcare, employment, housing, and ask, are these systems truly inclusive? Do they actually accommodate the needs of neurodivergent individuals? And if not, how can we work to change them?
This whole deep dive has really got me thinking about how we can all play a part, even in small ways, to create a more inclusive world.
I completely agree. Even those small actions, they can make a difference. Educate yourself about neurodiversity. Challenge those stereotypes and misconceptions that are out there.
Hmm.
Support those organizations that advocate for autistic individuals. Be an ally.
All great suggestions. This has been, I mean, truly enlightening. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of, not just neurodiversity affirming therapy, but its potential impact for individuals and for society as a whole.
It's been wonderful exploring all these ideas with you, and I hope this has encouraged our listeners to keep learning, keep questioning, keep challenging the status quo.
It definitely has. So, to our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. What's one small step you can take today to embrace neurodiversity, to create a more welcoming world for everyone? Keep those deep dives going, and until next time, stay curious.